Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics. You may have noticed, in particular, Brexit politics. And 10 months before the UK is set to finally leave the EU as the transition period ends, formal negotiations to agree long-term arrangements have begun this week. In this video, I'd like to discuss what has emerged from this first meeting and whether anything new may be gleaned from statements made. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So David Frost, who was leading the UK team, met Michel Barnier for the EU in Brussels earlier this week. There was no handshake, they said, to avoid spreading a certain virus that YouTube seemed not to like me talking about. And although many of us believe that these talks are a sham on the part of Boris Johnson, we must still view them as being the most important negotiations that the UK has ever undertaken, because the ramifications for the nation will be absolutely enormous. Unless, of course, Boris Johnson changes course in what would be, well, at the moment, seen as a hugely surprising U-turn. In a way, these negotiations could actually be instructive to many people in how international negotiations work. There would be intense interest in something that usually bores people rigid. I did have an amusing comment on one of my videos this week from a Leave supporter who seemed to be under the impression that these negotiations will effectively take the form of David Frost and a few aides around a table with Michel Barnier and a few aides, and that would be it. You know, a few people, a handful of people on either side of a table deciding extremely complex arrangements between over 24 different countries. All too typical of a misunderstanding of the realities of such a complex process as arranging international agreements. So to put it into context just how complex an operation this is, and it's not just a few people around a table, this was just preliminary talks. We were just getting them started. It was a few days in Brussels, and the UK sent a team of 100 officials. Bearing in mind that, as I say, this was just the first exploratory meetings, getting a few things sorted, getting a few points out, a setting out of aims, you might say, on both sides, face to face, as opposed to simply using press briefings to talk to each other. And this initial meeting has taken several days. It took most of the week, with lots of different groups getting together. So David Frost may be the leader for the UK, just as Michel Barnier is for the EU. But they will be coordinating efforts. They'll talk to each other and they'll be involved in various meetings, of course. But they cannot be at all the discussions at all the times, because that's impossible. There are too many going on all at the same time. David Frost did indeed have a meeting with Michel Barnier, of course. The talks are intended to work in stages. So it's not just, this is what we want, the EU saying, well, this is what we want, and trying to work out those points. There are markers throughout the year by which certain things are supposed to have been agreed. So 3 of the major issues to be agreed initially are on fishing rights, alignment with EU rules, and jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Agreements are supposed to be in place for all of these areas by summer, the date when Boris Johnson's government have said that they will walk away from talks if they're not going to get their, what they call their Canada deal. Obviously, we're not going to know the details of the discussions. They don't take place in public. We can only rely on what people who've attended them say afterwards, and most people don't say anything. That's for the leaders. So we have to go by press briefings. Interestingly, Michel Barnier did hold a press briefing. As far as I can tell, David Frost did not, highlighting, I suppose if true, that the EU have sent an elected politician who is perfectly at home speaking to the press, whereas the UK sent to lead our delegation an unelected bureaucrat and someone who is not so keen on facing public scrutiny. In his briefing, Barnier, and we've only got his briefing as far as I can tell, as I say, he made it clear that it will not be business as usual when the transition period ends. I'm sure this was a feature of the discussions themselves. The UK wants essentially everything to carry on as normal. So when the 1st of January 2021 comes along, it wants to be just normal. The sky hasn't fallen in. Great, that's fantastic. However, the EU have no doubt explained that it is in Britain's political interest to arrange this, because they will suffer the political consequences if it doesn't happen. It's not necessarily a priority for the EU. As such, it's for the UK to compromise and offer something in return for this. Barnier did make two clear points when he gave his statement. He called these two keys for success. The first one, he said, was not going back on commitments. Now, that is remarkable, isn't it? When you are meeting for international negotiations, to have to spell out in the very first press briefing after the first few days of talks that it will be really important not to go back on your word. It should be a given, shouldn't it? But it's not. It was a clear spotlight on the Irish protocol, I suppose, as well as others, but particularly that Boris Johnson has signed up to. He's making it clear that there will be no arrangements whatsoever unless the UK keeps its word. And you could take that as a wider point being made that even other countries are not going to want to deal with us if we do not keep our international commitments. The second point he wanted to make, the second key for success, was mutual respect and a lack of misunderstandings. Now, I would take this as a plea to not say one thing in the discussions privately and then brief the British public with mutually exclusive statements. Been a lot of that already. Again, we can go back to the Irish protocol there. Johnson saying there will be no checks on the border between Great Britain and Ireland, despite the fact that he has signed an international treaty that is available for the public to view, saying that there will be. It's important to remember that although the eyes of Brexit supporters will be on Boris Johnson to deliver what he said he would, and when it comes to us, everyone in Britain, the eyes of EU citizens will be on their champions to make sure the EU's interests are put first as well. So the first quarter of 2020 was all about getting the discussions underway. It's now sort of started. The second quarter leading up to summer will have to end with a stock-taking exercise. So Boris Johnson negotiated already, and he got in his withdrawal bill, that in the withdrawal agreement, which is now signed into UK law, that in June of this year, there will have to be a summit to discuss progress and to assess whether or not any sort of deal, whether a comprehensive deal or a bare bones deal, is at all possible. The summit will take place in the UK. Technically, this is also the period of time when the UK could request an extension without having to amend the Withdrawal Act, and when the government has threatened to end talks if they don't get their own way. But given the regularity of Brexit news in the months since we surrendered our EU membership, I can't imagine we're just going to be twiddling our thumbs waiting until summer before we learn new things. There are no doubt going to be some pretty major twists and turns on the way as well. So stay subscribed to be informed of all that. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.